"You don't look like you belong here." Those words would echo through Damon Rivers' mind for the rest of his life, but not for the reasons Victoria Lawson imagined when she first laid eyes on him in the first-class cabin of Flight 892 from JFK to London Heathrow. The morning air inside the Airbus A350 carried the familiar scent of expensive leather and that particular brand of quiet luxury that only existed at 30,000 feet above the problems of ordinary people. Damon had smelled it before, countless times on private jets with his father, but today he was flying commercial for the first time in years, a deliberate choice his father had insisted upon after Damon's 19th birthday. "You need to understand how the other half lives," Marcus Rivers had told his son over breakfast in their Chicago penthouse. "You can't lead people you don't understand, and you can't understand people whose struggles you've never witnessed even from a distance." So here, Damon sat in seat 3. His long frame folded into the premium leather chair, wearing an oversized slate-gray hoodie and loose black joggers that made him look like any other college kid traveling on someone else's dime. To most observers, he appeared to be exactly what Victoria Lawson would soon assume he was, a scholarship student who had somehow lucked into a first-class upgrade, or maybe a young athlete whose agent had sprung for the expensive seat. But the details told a different story to anyone who knew how to look. The watch on his wrist was a Patek Philippe Nautilus in rose gold, so rare that only 50 had ever been made, and each one cost more than most people's houses. The hoodie, while deliberately oversized and casual, was cut from Italian cashmere that felt like liquid silk against the skin. His sneakers were unreleased, Jordan prototypes that wouldn't hit stores for another 6 months, personally gifted by the designer who happened to be his father's college roommate. Damon adjusted his noise-canceling headphones and opened the book he'd been reading, a biography of Thurgood Marshall that his father had recommended. He had 3 hours before takeoff time enough to finish the chapter about Marshall's early cases fighting segregation in graduate schools. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was reading about a man who had fought for the right to sit where he belonged while surrounded by an environment where his own right to belong would soon be questioned. The first-class cabin filled slowly around him. A tech executive in seat 4B was already on his laptop, typing furiously while sipping coffee from a china cup. Across the aisle, a fashion editor was reviewing contact sheets from what appeared to be a recent photo shoot, her expertly manicured fingers flicking through images with practiced efficiency. Near the back of the first-class section, in seat 5B, an elderly woman was settling in with a young girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The child had bright, curious eyes and was pressed against the window watching the ground crew load baggage with the kind of fascination that only children could maintain for such mundane activities. "Grandma, why do they put the suitcases in the bottom of the plane?" The little girl asked, her voice carrying the clear, bell-like quality of childhood innocence. "That's where they keep them safe during the flight, sweetheart," her grandmother replied with the patient tone of someone who had answered 1,000 such questions and would happily answer 1,000 more. Damon smiled despite himself. Children saw the world differently, asked questions that adults had learned to stop asking, noticed things that grown-ups had trained themselves to ignore. His father had often told him that the most important business decisions he'd ever made had come from listening to questions that seemed simple on the surface but revealed complex truths underneath. The flight attendant, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and the practiced smile of someone who had learned to navigate the delicate social dynamics of first-class service, approached his seat with a glass of water and a warm towel. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice carrying just the slightest hint of curiosity. "I'm Sophia, and I'll be taking care of you today. Can I get you anything before we begin boarding the other passengers?" "Just the water is perfect, thank you," Damon replied, accepting the crystal glass with a nod of appreciation. "And please, call me Damon." Sophia's smile became more genuine, less rehearsed. "Of course, Damon. We should be pushing back on time this morning. Weather looks good all the way to London. Are you traveling for business or pleasure?" "A little of both, I suppose," Damon said, closing his book but keeping his finger marking the page. "Visiting some family friends, maybe doing some sightseeing while I'm there." It wasn't technically a lie, though it wasn't the complete truth either. He was indeed visiting family friends, but those friends happened to include several members of Parliament and the CEO of Britain's largest investment bank. The sightseeing would likely take place between board meetings and charity galas, the kind of high society gatherings where 19-year-olds were rarely seen unless they were serving drinks or carrying messages. As more passengers continued boarding, Damon noticed the small rituals and hierarchies that governed this particular slice of the aviation world. First-class passengers boarded with a sense of entitlement that was so deeply ingrained it seemed natural, expecting their champagne to appear without asking, their carry-on luggage to be handled with white glove care, their every minor preference to be anticipated and accommodated, without them having to voice it explicitly. He had grown up in this world, but today he was seeing it from a slightly different angle, noticing the way people looked at each other, the quick assessments and judgments that passed between strangers who shared nothing except the ability to afford expensive airplane seats. And then Victoria Lawson stepped aboard, and the entire atmosphere of the cabin shifted like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air pressure drops and everyone can feel the electricity building in the sky. Victoria Lawson entered the first-class cabin with the kind of presence that demanded attention even when she wasn't trying to command it. She was 52 years old, though her platinum blonde hair was styled and maintained with the kind of precision that suggested she spent more on personal grooming in a month than most people earned in a year. Her face was sharp-featured and carefully maintained with the kind of bone structure that photographs beautifully, and the kind of expression that suggested she was perpetually disappointed by a world that consistently failed to meet her exacting standards. Behind her trailed her husband Richard, a man who seemed to exist primarily as an extension of her will, rather than as an independent human being. He was carrying both of their carry-on bags, his shoulders slightly hunched under the weight, his eyes darting nervously around the cabin as if he were calculating the social dynamics and finding himself lacking in some fundamental way. Victoria's gaze swept across the first-class cabin with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to assess and categorize people within seconds of encountering them. She noted the tech executive in 4B clearly knew money based on his choice of laptop and the way he hunched over it like someone who had never learned to be comfortable with leisure. The fashion editor earned a slight nod of approval. Her accessories were current enough to suggest relevance but classic enough to indicate taste. And then her eyes landed on Damon Rivers in seat 3A, and her entire expression shifted into something harder, more calculating. She stopped walking so abruptly that Richard nearly collided with her from behind, stumbling slightly as he tried to maintain his balance while carrying their luggage. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of crisp authority that comes from a lifetime of having people jump to attention when she speaks. She wasn't addressing Damon directly. Instead, she was speaking to Sophia, who had been making her way through the cabin, checking that overhead compartments were properly secured. Sophia approached with the cautious smile of someone who recognized the potential for conflict, but was professionally obligated to try to diffuse it. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" "There seems to be some kind of mistake," Victoria continued, gesturing toward Damon without actually looking at him directly. "That young man is sitting in my seat." Sophia glanced at her tablet, then at the seat numbers, then at Victoria's boarding pass. "Ma'am, I show that you're assigned to seat 4A, and your husband is in 4B. The gentleman in 3A has a valid boarding pass for that seat." Victoria's lips tightened into what might generously be called a smile, but looked more like the expression a snake might make if snakes could express disdain. "I don't think you understand. I always sit in 3A. I am a Platinum Premier member. I fly this route monthly for business, and I specifically requested that seat when my assistant made this reservation." From her seat in 5B, 8-year-old Emma looked up from her coloring book. her young face creased with the kind of confusion that children experience when the adult world suddenly stops making sense around them. "Grandma," she whispered, tugging on her grandmother's sleeve. "Why is that pretty lady being mean to the nice boy?" Her grandmother, whose name was Eleanor, and who had lived through enough decades to recognize the particular brand of ugliness that was about to unfold, gently shushed her granddaughter while keeping her eyes fixed on the scene developing in front of them. Victoria heard the child's whisper, and her expression hardened further. She was not accustomed to having her behavior questioned, especially not by children who clearly didn't understand the complexities of proper social order. "Richard," she said sharply, turning to her husband, "show her the confirmation email. Tell her about my status with this airline." Richard fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to pull up the requested information. He was clearly uncomfortable with the direction this confrontation was taking, but he had long ago learned that questioning his wife's judgment in public was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Darling," he said, quietly leaning close to her ear, "perhaps we should just take our assigned seats. They look perfectly comfortable, and we'll be in London before you know it." Victoria turned to look at her husband with an expression that could have frozen champagne. "I am not taking a back seat to anyone, Richard. Especially not to someone who clearly doesn't understand the standards expected in this section of the aircraft." Damon, who had been watching this entire exchange with the kind of calm attention his father had taught him to maintain in situations where emotions were running high and rational thinking was at a premium, finally decided to speak. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry through the cabin. "I'd be happy to show you my boarding pass if that would help resolve this situation." He reached into the front pocket of his hoodie and withdrew his boarding pass, holding it up so that Victoria could see the seat assignment clearly printed in bold letters, 3A. Victoria glanced at the boarding pass, then back at Damon, then at Sophia, as if she were waiting for someone to acknowledge that this was all some elaborate misunderstanding that would shortly be corrected by someone with the authority to make things right. "That doesn't make sense," she said, her voice rising slightly. "There must be some kind of error in your system. Perhaps his ticket was issued incorrectly, or maybe he's been upgraded without proper authorization." Emma tugged on her grandmother's sleeve again, her voice still carrying that peculiar loudness that children use when they're trying to whisper but haven't quite mastered the technique. "Why doesn't she want him to sit there? Grandma." "He was there first, and he's being polite." Eleanor glanced around the cabin, noting that other passengers were beginning to pay attention to the commotion. The fashion editor had lowered her contact sheets and was watching the scene with sharp, intelligent eyes that suggested she was recording every detail for potential future use. The tech executive had stopped typing and was listening with the kind of focused attention that people usually reserved for conference calls where their jobs might be on the line. "Sometimes," sweetheart Eleanor said carefully, "adults forget how to use their manners even when they're in fancy places that should remind them to be their best selves." Victoria heard this comment as well, and her face flushed with anger that she was clearly struggling to control. She was not accustomed to being criticized, however indirectly, and she was certainly not going to tolerate it from strangers who didn't understand her position or her rights as a premium passenger. "This is ridiculous," she announced to the cabin at large, her voice now loud enough that there was no longer any pretense that this was a private conversation. "I pay good money for these seats. I expect a certain standard of service and a certain caliber of fellow passengers. This young man clearly doesn't belong in first class, and I shouldn't have to share this space with people who don't understand proper airline etiquette." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that everyone could smell but nobody quite knew how to extinguish. The silence that followed Victoria's declaration felt thick and dangerous, like the moment after lightning strikes when everyone is waiting for the thunder to arrive. Damon remained perfectly still in his seat, his book still open in his lap, his expression carefully neutral in the way that his father had taught him to maintain when facing situations that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control them. Ma'am Sophia said, her voice still professionally calm, but with an edge of steel that suggested she was reaching the limits of her patience. "I need to ask you to lower your voice and take your assigned seat. All of our passengers have valid tickets and we need to complete our pre-flight preparations." Victoria's eyes flashed with the kind of anger that comes from someone who has spent her entire adult life getting her way through sheer force of will and is suddenly discovering that her usual tactics might not work in every situation. "Don't you dare tell me to lower my voice," she snapped. "I am a paying customer. I have rights, and I am simply asking for the service that I have paid for and that I deserve." Richard placed a gentle hand on his wife's arm, his face pale with embarrassment. "Victoria, please, everyone is watching." She shook off his hand with an irritated gesture. "Let them watch. Maybe they'll learn something about maintaining standards." From across the aisle, the fashion editor had discreetly pulled out her phone and was holding it at an angle that would allow her to record the interaction without being obvious about it. She had witnessed enough ugly scenes in her career to recognize when something was about to become genuinely newsworthy, and every instinct she had developed over decades in the media industry was telling her that this situation was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Emma, who had been coloring in her book with intense concentration, looked up again with the kind of direct, unfiltered curiosity that only children possess. "Grandma," she said, not bothering to lower her voice this time. Why is she so angry at him? He didn't do anything wrong. He's just sitting there reading his book. Eleanor wrapped her arm around her granddaughter's shoulders, pulling her closer. "Some people get upset when the world doesn't work exactly the way they think it should, sweetheart. They forget that being kind is more important than getting their way." Victoria whirled around to face them, her platinum hair catching the cabin lights in a way that made her look almost ethereal, if ethereal beings could radiate that much barely controlled fury. "Are you people seriously going to sit there and act like I'm the unreasonable one?" she demanded. "This is a premium cabin with premium prices, and passengers have a right to expect that certain standards will be maintained." "What standards are those exactly?" The voice came from the tech executive in 4B who had closed his laptop and was now giving Victoria his full attention. Victoria turned to face him clearly, relieved to be addressing someone who looked more like her idea of an appropriate first-class passenger. Standards of dress, standards of behavior, standards that ensure everyone's comfort and safety during the flight. "I see," the tech executive said mildly. "And what about this young man's dress or behavior makes you feel unsafe?" For a moment, Victoria seemed to realize that she had painted herself into a corner. She couldn't articulate exactly what her objection was, without saying things that would make her look even worse than she already did. But she also couldn't back down without losing face in front of an audience that was growing more hostile by the minute. "It's not about any one specific thing," she said finally. "It's about maintaining the atmosphere that people expect when they pay for first-class service." Damon, who had been listening to this entire exchange with the kind of careful attention that his father had taught him to pay when people revealed who they really were under pressure, finally decided that the time for silence had passed. "Ma'am," he said, standing up slowly and turning to face Victoria directly, "I understand that you're concerned about maintaining standards. I respect that. But I've shown you my valid boarding pass, I haven't disturbed anyone, and I've been nothing but polite to you and to the flight attendants." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "If there's something specific about my presence here that's making you uncomfortable, I'd appreciate it if you could explain what that is, because I'm honestly confused about what I've done wrong." Victoria's face went through a series of expressions as she tried to formulate a response that would justify her position without making her look like exactly what everyone in the cabin was beginning to realize she was. She opened her mouth, closed, it opened it again, and then did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She reached out and slapped Damon's hand as he extended it toward her in what appeared to be an attempt at a peaceful gesture. The sound of her palm connecting with his knuckles was sharp and clear, audible throughout the cabin like a gunshot in a library. For a moment, everyone froze as if the laws of physics had temporarily suspended themselves, and nobody was quite sure what was supposed to happen next. Emma's crayon stopped moving across her coloring book, her young eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "Grandma," she whispered. "She hit him. Why did she hit him? He was being nice." Eleanor's face had gone very pale, and her arm tightened protectively around her granddaughter. She had lived through the civil rights era, had seen ugliness that she had hoped her granddaughter would never have to witness, and here it was playing out in front of them, in a space that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of civilized travel. "Sometimes, sweetheart," she said quietly, "people do things that are wrong because they're scared of things they don't understand. That doesn't make it okay, but it helps explain why it happens." The fashion editor was no longer being subtle about her recording. Her phone was pointed directly at Victoria and Damon, capturing everything in high definition for an audience that would number in the millions once this footage inevitably made its way to social media. Sophia stepped forward, her professional composure finally cracking. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat immediately. Physical contact with other passengers is absolutely not tolerated on this aircraft." Victoria looked around the cabin, suddenly seeming to realize that every eye was fixed on her, that every expression ranged from disgusted to outraged, and that she had somehow become the villain in a story that she had thought she was directing toward a completely different conclusion. He was being threatening," she stammered, but even she didn't seem to believe it. "I felt unsafe. I was defending myself." Richard, who had been standing behind his wife throughout this entire confrontation, finally found his voice. "Victoria, for God's sake, stop. Just stop talking and sit down." But Victoria had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and she seemed to realize it. Instead of backing down, she doubled down, her voice rising to a level that could probably be heard in business class. "I will not be intimidated by people who don't belong here," she declared. "I will not be made to feel guilty for expecting the standards that I have paid for and that I deserve." Damon looked at his hand where she had slapped it, noting the red mark that was already beginning to fade. He looked at Emma, whose young face was creased with confusion and distress. He looked at Eleanor, who was watching him with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of decades of similar scenes played out in different settings. And then he looked at Victoria, and instead of the anger that everyone expected to see in his expression, there was something that looked almost like pity. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm going to go sit somewhere else because I don't want to make this flight any more unpleasant for the other passengers than it already has been. But I want you to know that you're going to remember this moment for the rest of your life, and not in the way you think you will." He gathered his book and his small bag, nodded politely to Sophia, and began walking toward the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. As he passed Emma's seat, the little girl reached out and touched his arm gently. "I'm sorry she was mean to you," she said in her clear, honest voice. "You seem really nice, and I don't understand why she didn't like you." Damon knelt down so that he was at her eye level, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked just enough to reveal the hurt underneath. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "Sometimes grown-ups forget how to be kind to each other. But kids like you help remind us what's really important." He stood up and continued walking, disappearing through the curtain into the main cabin of the aircraft, leaving behind a first-class section that would never quite feel the same to anyone who had witnessed what had just transpired. Victoria sank into seat 3, the seat she had fought so hard to claim, and discovered that victory could taste surprisingly bitter when it came at the cost of your humanity. The economy cabin felt like stepping into a different world, one where the air was warmer and more crowded, where conversations were louder and less filtered, where children cried openly instead of being efficiently shushed by nannies or governesses. Damon made his way down the narrow aisle until he found his newly assigned seat, 24C, a middle seat, between a college-aged young man who was already asleep with his mouth slightly open, and a middle-aged woman who was nervously flipping through a magazine about celebrity gossip. The young man appeared to be a backpacker, judging from the worn travel guides sticking out of his seat pocket and the way he was using a rolled-up sweatshirt as a pillow. The woman glanced up as Damon approached, offering him a quick, sympathetic smile. Coming back from first class, she asked quietly, having clearly witnessed at least part of the commotion through the gap in the curtains. "I saw some of what happened up there. That lady was completely out of line." Damon nodded as he settled into the cramped middle seat, immediately noticing how different the experience was from the spacious luxury he had left behind. His knees pressed against the seat back in front of him, and the armrests were narrow enough that sharing them required a delicate negotiation of personal space that he had never had to navigate in first class. "Thank you for saying that," he replied, pulling out his phone and checking the time. "Sometimes people have bad days and take it out on whoever happens to be convenient." The woman whose name tag identified her as Linda, and who worked as a nurse practitioner in Detroit, studied his face with the kind of clinical assessment that healthcare professionals develop after years of reading people's emotional states. "Honey," she said gently, "that wasn't someone having a bad day. That was someone showing you exactly who she is when she thinks there won't be any consequences." Damon considered this observation as he pulled out his second phone, the one that looked identical to his regular iPhone, but was actually a military-grade encrypted satellite device that could send secure messages anywhere in the world without relying on commercial cellular networks. His father had insisted he carry it after a kidnapping attempt 2 years earlier that had been thwarted only because their security team had been able to track his location in real time. He opened the secure messaging app and typed a message to Marcus Stone, the director of aviation for Rivers Holdings, and the man responsible for managing the family's extensive fleet of private jets, as well as their commercial aviation investments. Marcus' quick question about N847RL. Currently aboard this aircraft from JFK to LHR. Had an incident with passenger Victoria Lawson, who forced me out of seat 3A. She claimed I didn't belong in first class. Became physical when I tried to reason with her. Currently relocated to economy. Wanted you to be aware in case this escalates further. The response came back almost immediately, which didn't surprise Damon since Marcus was notorious for being available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of time zones or holidays. Checking ownership records now. Stand by. Damon watched the 3 dots that indicated Marcus was typing, knowing that somewhere in a corporate office in Chicago, one of the most efficient men he had ever met was pulling up databases and cross-referencing tail numbers with lease agreements and ownership structures. Damon. This is bigger than I initially thought. N847RL is owned by Rivers Holdings subsidiary Apex Aviation Management. We lease it to the commercial carrier under a partnership agreement that includes specific conduct clauses. If a passenger has assaulted a member of the Rivers family or violated the terms of carriage, we have the right to ground the aircraft immediately. Damon stared at his phone screen, realizing that what had felt like a personal humiliation might actually have much broader implications than he had initially understood. She slapped my hand when I tried to extend it in a peace gesture. Multiple witnesses, including a child. Also made several statements about who does and doesn't belong in first class that were clearly racially motivated. That constitutes assault and violates federal transportation safety regulations, as well as our lease terms. Do you want me to initiate Protocol 7? Protocol 7 was something Damon had heard his father mention, but had never seen implemented. It was the nuclear option for situations involving Rivers Holdings assets, a coordinated response that could involve everything from legal action to federal investigations, depending on the severity of the incident. What exactly does Protocol 7 involve? Damon typed back. Immediate grounding of aircraft, full passenger manifest review, law enforcement notification, legal team deployment, and media strategy coordination. Once initiated, it can't be reversed until the situation is fully resolved. This could affect 300-plus passengers and cost the airline significant money in delays and rebooking. Damon looked around the economy cabin, noting the families with small children, the business travelers who were probably rushing to important meetings, the elderly couples who might be visiting grandchildren they hadn't seen in months. All of these people would be affected by his decision, but then again they had also been affected by Victoria's behavior, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. "Marcus, let me ask you something. If I don't pursue this, what happens? Nothing. She gets away with assaulting you. The airline learns that this behavior is acceptable as long as the victim doesn't fight back, and the next person she targets might not have the resources or support system to defend themselves." That settled it. Damon thought about Emma, the 8-year-old girl who had asked such innocent questions about why the pretty lady was being mean to the nice boy. What lesson would she learn if adults could behave that way without consequences? What would she think about justice and fairness and the idea that good people were supposed to stand up for what was right? "Initiate Protocol 7, he typed. "But Marcus, I want this handled with as much class as possible. The goal is accountability and education, not revenge. Understood. Expect contact from the aircraft within the next 10 minutes. This is going to get very interesting very quickly." Damon locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket, then leaned back in his cramped seat and closed his eyes. Around him, the normal sounds of a commercial flight continued. Babies crying, passengers chatting, flight attendants preparing the cabin for takeoff. In a few minutes, all of that would change, and he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for what was about to happen. Linda, the nurse practitioner, was still watching him with that clinical attention that healthcare workers develop. "You okay, honey?" she asked. "You look like someone who just made a decision that's going to change everything." Damon opened his eyes and looked at her, noting the kindness in her expression and the genuine concern in her voice. "I think I just did," he said quietly. "I'm not sure if it's the right decision, but it's the only one I can live with." Up in first class, Victoria Lawson was settling into seat 3A with the satisfaction of someone who had fought for what she believed was rightfully hers and had emerged victorious. She accepted a glass of champagne from Sophia and began reviewing emails on her phone, already mentally moving past the unpleasant incident with the young man who had clearly not understood his place in the natural order of things. She had no idea that in approximately 8 minutes, her entire world was about to come crashing down around her in ways that she could never have anticipated and would never be able to forget. The first sign that something was wrong came when the aircraft, which had been slowly taxiing toward the runway in the normal queue of departing flights, suddenly came to a complete stop. Not the gradual deceleration of a plane waiting for takeoff clearance, but an abrupt halt that caused drinks to slosh and passengers to look up from their books and magazines with mild concern. Victoria barely noticed the change at first, absorbed as she was in responding to emails from her personal assistant about upcoming social events and charity galas that required her attention. She had already mentally moved past the incident with the young man in the hoodie, filing it away as an unfortunate but necessary assertion of proper standards that would hopefully prevent similar situations in the future. The second sign came when the engines, which had been maintaining their normal taxi power setting, suddenly spooled down to a complete shutdown. The familiar vibration that passengers learn to associate with an aircraft in motion disappeared entirely, replaced by an eerie silence that made even the most frequent flyers begin to feel uneasy. Richard, who was sitting in the seat directly behind Victoria and who had been trying to disappear into his financial newspapers ever since the confrontation, looked up with the expression of a man who had learned to recognize when situations were about to spiral beyond anyone's control. "Victoria," he said quietly, leaning forward in his seat. "Something's happening." She turned to look at him with the irritated expression she reserved for interruptions to her important work. "What are you talking about? We're just waiting for takeoff clearance." "No." Richard said, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern that she had learned to recognize over their 22 years of marriage. "This is different. Planes don't shut down their engines unless something is seriously wrong." Before Victoria could respond, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom system with an announcement that was noticeably different from the usual pre-flight pleasantries. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking from the flight deck. We apologize, but we have received an urgent operational directive that requires us to return to the gate immediately. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we work to resolve this situation as quickly as possible." A murmur of confusion and mild concern rippled through the first-class cabin. The tech executive in 4B looked up from his laptop with a frown, wondering if this delay would affect his presentation to a London-based client. The fashion editor put down her contact sheets and began typing rapidly on her phone, probably alerting her team to a potential schedule change. Emma, the 8-year-old girl in 5B, looked up from her coloring book with the kind of direct, uncomplicated curiosity that only children possess in situations that confuse adults. "Grandma," she said in her clear, carrying voice, "why did the airplane stop? Are we not going to London anymore?" Eleanor, her grandmother, wrapped an arm around the child's shoulders and spoke in the soothing tone that grandmothers have perfected over generations of dealing with unexpected situations. "I'm sure it's just a small problem that the pilots need to fix, sweetheart. Sometimes airplanes are like cars that need to go back to the garage for a quick checkup before they can continue their trip." But Eleanor's eyes were sharp and worried as she glanced around the cabin, noting the way the flight attendants were moving with slightly more urgency than usual, and the way some of the other passengers were beginning to look genuinely concerned rather than just mildly inconvenienced. Victoria, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly agitated as she watched her carefully planned schedule begin to disintegrate around her. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she announced, to no one in particular, her voice carrying the kind of authority that she was accustomed to having respected immediately. "I have a very important meeting in London this afternoon, and I cannot afford to miss it because of some minor mechanical issue." She pressed the call button above her seat repeatedly, each press more aggressive than the last, until Sophia appeared at her side with the kind of strained smile that flight attendants develop when dealing with difficult passengers during stressful situations. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you? I need you to contact the captain immediately and explain that I am a Platinum Premier member with urgent business in London. Surely whatever this problem is can be resolved quickly so that we can continue on schedule." Sophia's smile became even more strained. "Ma'am, I assure you that the captain and crew are working to resolve this situation as quickly as possible. We don't have any additional information at this time, but I'll certainly pass along your concerns." "That's not good enough," Victoria snapped. "I demand to know exactly what the problem is and how long this delay is expected to last. Do you people have any idea how much money this airline loses when they inconvenience premium passengers?" From economy class, where Damon was sitting in his cramped middle seat between the sleeping backpacker and Linda, the nurse practitioner. The announcement sounded different. He knew exactly what was happening, and he found himself feeling an unexpected mixture of anticipation and regret. Protocol 7 had been initiated, which meant that within the next few minutes, Victoria Lawson was going to discover that actions had consequences in ways she had probably never experienced before. Linda was watching his face with that same clinical attention she had shown earlier, noting the way his expression had changed during the captain's announcement. "You know what this is about, don't you?" she said quietly. "This isn't a mechanical problem." Damon nodded slowly. "No. It's not mechanical. It's personal." "Good," Linda said with surprising firmness. "People like that woman need to learn that they can't treat other human beings like garbage just because they think their money makes them special." The aircraft began to move again, but not toward the runway. Instead, it was being towed back toward the terminal, pulled by a tug vehicle, like a misbehaving child being dragged back to the principal's office. Passengers who were familiar with normal airport operations began to realize that this was not a routine delay, but something much more serious and potentially time-consuming. Victoria's agitation was escalating by the minute. She had unfastened her seatbelt despite the captain's instructions and was standing in the aisle, her platinum blonde hair catching the cabin lights as she gestured emphatically at Sophia. "This is completely unacceptable," she was saying, her voice loud enough to be heard throughout the first-class cabin. "I pay good money for reliable service, and I expect this airline to honor its commitments to its premium passengers." Emma looked up from her coloring book again, her young face creased with the kind of confusion that children experience when adults around them begin behaving in ways that don't match what they've been taught about proper behavior. "Grandma," she whispered, "why is the pretty lady being loud again? I thought airplane rules said we're supposed to use our inside voices." Eleanor glanced around the cabin, noting that other passengers were beginning to look at Victoria with expressions ranging from annoyance to outright disgust. The woman's behavior was creating exactly the kind of disruption that she had claimed to be concerned about when she had confronted Damon about his presence in first class. "Sometimes," sweetheart Eleanor said carefully, "people forget about using their inside voices when they're worried or upset. But that doesn't make it okay to disturb other people who are trying to be patient and polite." The aircraft came to a final stop at the gate, and passengers could see through the windows that this was not a normal arrival. Instead of the usual ground crew with baggage carts and refueling equipment, there appeared to be several people in suits waiting at the jet bridge, along with what looked like security personnel. Victoria pressed her face against the window of seat 3A, the seat she had fought so hard to claim, and felt a cold spike of unease as she noted the official-looking vehicles parked near the aircraft and the serious expressions on the faces of the people waiting to board. "Richard," she called to her husband, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that she usually worked very hard to suppress. "Does this look normal to you?" Richard joined her at the window, his own face pale with a growing apprehension that he couldn't quite articulate but could definitely feel settling in his stomach like a lead weight. "No," he said quietly. "This doesn't look normal at all." The aircraft door opened with a mechanical hiss that seemed louder than usual in the tense atmosphere of the cabin, and instead of the typical gate agent or ground crew member stepping aboard the first person to enter, was a woman in a sharp charcoal gray business suit carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression that suggested she was not here to discuss flight schedules or passenger amenities. Behind her came two Port Authority police officers, their hands resting casually but visibly on their duty belts, followed by a man in a dark suit with the kind of bearing that suggested federal law enforcement. The final member of the group was another woman, this one carrying a tablet and wearing a lanyard that identified her as legal counsel for Rivers Holdings. Victoria, who was still standing in the aisle despite repeated instructions to remain seated, felt a cold flutter of apprehension as she watched this official-looking group make their way into the first-class cabin. She had dealt with airline staff before, had demanded supervisors and managers when situations didn't go her way, but this felt different. This felt serious in a way that her usual tactics might not be able to handle. The woman in the charcoal suit stepped forward and addressed the cabin at large, her voice clear and authoritative in the way that comes from years of delivering difficult news to people who don't want to hear it. "Good morning, passengers. I am Elena Voss, Senior Legal Counsel for Rivers Holdings. We apologize for the inconvenience, but we have a matter of security and passenger safety that requires immediate attention." She consulted her tablet, then looked directly at Victoria with the kind of focused attention that made it clear this was not a random security check or routine procedure. "Mrs. Victoria Lawson." Victoria's mouth went dry, but she managed to maintain her composure enough to respond. "Yes, that's me. What exactly is this about Mrs. Lawson? You are currently in violation of the passenger conduct agreement for this aircraft. We have reports of physical assault against a fellow passenger as well as discriminatory behavior that violates both federal transportation regulations and the specific terms of the lease agreement under which this aircraft operates." The first-class cabin fell completely silent. Even the ambient noise from the engines and air conditioning seemed to have stopped, creating a vacuum of attention that focused entirely on the interaction between Elena Voss and Victoria Lawson. "That's ridiculous," Victoria said, her voice rising with indignation. "I did no such thing. I was simply trying to resolve a seating mix-up with someone who clearly didn't belong in this section of the aircraft." Elena Voss glanced at her tablet again, then back at Victoria. "Mrs. Lawson, we have multiple witness statements, including video evidence of you physically striking another passenger and making statements about who does and doesn't belong in first class based on their appearance and perceived socioeconomic status." From her seat in 5B, Emma was watching this exchange with wide eyes, her coloring book forgotten in her lap. She tugged on her grandmother's sleeve and whispered, "Grandma is the pretty lady in trouble because she was mean to the nice boy." Eleanor pulled her granddaughter closer and nodded slightly. "Sometimes, sweetheart, when people do things that hurt others, there are consequences. That's how we learn to be better." Victoria's face had gone pale, but she was clearly not ready to back down. "I want to speak to the captain immediately. I want to know who's responsible for this harassment, and I want to file a formal complaint about the way I'm being treated." Mrs. Lawson, Elena Voss continued, her voice remaining perfectly calm and professional. "This aircraft is owned by Rivers Holdings and leased to the commercial carrier under an agreement that includes specific conduct clauses. When a passenger assaults or discriminates against a member of the Rivers family, we have the right to remove that passenger and ban them from all Rivers Holdings transportation assets." The words hung in the air for a moment as Victoria tried to process their meaning. Rivers Holdings. What does that have to do with anything? And what member of what family? Elena Voss gestured toward the curtain that separated first class from the main cabin. "Mr. Rivers, would you please join us?" Every head in the first-class cabin turned toward the curtain as footsteps approached from the economy section. Victoria felt her stomach drop as she recognized the young man in the oversized hoodie walking back through the aircraft, the same person she had dismissed as someone who didn't belong among premium passengers. Damon Rivers stepped into the first-class cabin with the same quiet confidence he had displayed throughout the entire incident, his expression neutral, but his eyes alert and focused. He was still wearing the casual clothes that had led Victoria to make assumptions about his background and financial status. But now those assumptions were crumbling around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. "Hello, Mrs. Lawson," Damon said quietly, his voice carrying no anger or vindictiveness, just a calm acknowledgement of the situation they now found themselves in. "I believe we need to have a conversation." Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times as she tried to formulate a response that would make sense of what was happening around her. The pieces were starting to come together in her mind, but she was fighting against accepting what they seemed to be telling her. "Rivers Holdings," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You're part of the Rivers family? The Marcus Rivers who owns half the aviation industry in North America," his son Damon confirmed. "And you just forcibly removed me from a seat on an aircraft that my family owns because you didn't think I belonged there." The color drained completely from Victoria's face as the full magnitude of her mistake became clear. She had not only assaulted someone, she had assaulted someone whose family had the power to make her life very complicated in ways she was only beginning to understand. Richard, who had been watching this exchange from his seat with growing horror, finally found his voice. "Victoria, for God's sake, apologize. Apologize right now and maybe we can work something out." But Elena Voss was already consulting her tablet again, and her expression suggested that the time for apologies had passed. "Mrs. Lawson, you and your husband are hereby banned from all Rivers Holdings transportation assets, which includes not only this aircraft, but also our partnerships with Delta United American Airlines and British Airways. You will be escorted off this aircraft immediately, and security personnel will ensure that you are placed on the no-fly list for all affiliated carriers." Victoria staggered backward, her hand reaching for the seat back to steady herself. "You can't do this. I have rights. I have meetings in London. My husband has business commitments." "Mrs. Lawson," Elena continued, "your rights ended when you chose to physically assault another passenger and engage in discriminatory behavior. Your husband's business commitments are unfortunate collateral damage from your poor choices." The Port Authority officers stepped forward their presence, making it clear that this was no longer a negotiation, but an enforcement action. "Ma'am," one of them said in a polite but firm tone, "we need you to gather your personal belongings and come with us." Victoria looked around the cabin desperately, as if hoping that someone would speak up on her behalf, or that this would somehow reveal itself to be an elaborate misunderstanding. But the other passengers were watching her with expressions that ranged from satisfaction to outright disgust, and even her own husband was avoiding eye contact. Emma, who had been following this entire exchange with the focused attention that children bring to adult drama, raised her hand tentatively as if she were in a classroom. "Excuse me," she said in her clear carrying voice, addressing Elena Voss directly. "Is the nice boy going to be okay now? Is he going to get to keep his seat?" Elena Voss looked down at the 8-year-old with a slight smile, the first break in her professional demeanor since she had boarded the aircraft. "Yes, sweetheart," she said gently. "The nice boy is going to be just fine, and he's going to sit wherever he wants to sit." Emma nodded with satisfaction and returned to her coloring book, apparently considering the matter resolved in the most important way possible. Victoria gathered her purse and carry-on bag with hands that were shaking visibly, her movements jerky and uncoordinated as the full reality of her situation began to sink in. She had woken up that morning as a wealthy, privileged woman whose biggest concern was making sure she got the airplane seat she preferred. Now she was being escorted off an aircraft by police officers banned from multiple airlines and facing the prospect of having to explain to her social circle how she had managed to destroy her reputation in the span of 30 minutes. As the officers flanked her and began guiding her toward the aircraft door, she turned back one last time to look at Damon Rivers, the young man whose presence in first class had triggered this entire catastrophic sequence of events. "I didn't know," she said, her voice small and broken. "I didn't know who you were." Damon looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was quiet but clear enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, "that's exactly the problem. It shouldn't have mattered who I was." The silence that followed Damon's words felt heavy and final, like the moment after a judge delivers a verdict that everyone knows is both inevitable and irreversible. Victoria was led away by the Port Authority officers, her platinum blonde hair no longer catching the cabin lights in quite the same way her designer clothes somehow looking less impressive when worn by someone whose world was collapsing around her. But Elena Voss was not finished. As soon as Victoria disappeared through the aircraft door, she turned her attention to Richard, who had been sitting frozen in his seat, as if hoping that remaining perfectly still might somehow make him invisible to whatever forces were reshaping his life. "Mr. Richard Lawson," she said, her voice carrying the same professional authority that had just dismantled his wife's sense of entitlement. Richard looked up with the expression of a man who had spent the last 20 minutes watching his comfortable existence disintegrate piece by piece, and was beginning to suspect that the worst was yet to come. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the aircraft systems. "Sir, I need to inform you that while you're not being removed from this flight for discriminatory behavior, there are other matters that require our attention." As if on cue, 2 additional men in dark suits entered the aircraft, these carrying the unmistakable bearing and credentials of federal law enforcement. The lead agent, a man with graying hair and the kind of face that suggested he had seen enough of human nature's darker aspects to surprise him, only rarely approached Richard's seat with the methodical precision of someone who had performed this routine many times before. "Richard Lawson," he said, displaying his credentials. Special Agent Martinez, FBI, Financial Crimes Division. You're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. The words hit the first-class cabin like a physical blow. Passengers who had been focused on the drama involving Victoria suddenly found themselves witnessing something even more serious, a federal arrest that suggested this situation had implications far beyond airline passenger behavior. Emma looked up from her coloring book again, her young face creased with confusion as she tried to process what was happening around her. "Grandma," she whispered, "why are the police here? Are both of the mean people in trouble now?" Eleanor wrapped her arms more tightly around her granddaughter, her own face pale as she realized that what she had initially assumed was a simple case of passenger misconduct had revealed itself to be something much darker and more complex. "Sometimes, sweetheart," she said carefully, "when people do bad things, it turns out they've been doing other bad things too. The police are here to make sure everyone is safe." Agent Martinez was reading Richard his rights in the calm, professional tone that federal agents use when executing warrants, but his voice was loud enough that everyone in the first-class cabin could hear every word. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Richard's face had gone ashen and his hands were shaking as Agent Martinez placed him in handcuffs. "I don't understand," he stammered. "What securities fraud? What money laundering? I run a legitimate hedge fund." "Mr. Lawson," Agent Martinez replied, "your hedge fund has been under federal investigation for the past 18 months. We have evidence of a Ponzi scheme involving over $200 million in fraudulent investments, as well as connections to offshore money laundering operations." The tech executive in 4B looked up from his laptop with wide eyes, realizing that he was witnessing not just passenger drama, but an actual federal arrest for financial crimes. The fashion editor had her phone out again, recording everything with the focused intensity of someone who recognized a major news story when it was unfolding right in front of her. Elena Voss consulted her tablet once more, then addressed the cabin at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for these disruptions to your travel plans. We're working to resolve this situation as quickly as possible so that we can continue to London with minimal additional delay." Damon, who had been watching this entire sequence of events with the calm attention his father had taught him to maintain during crisis situations, stepped forward. "Elena," he said quietly, "how long have the federal authorities been monitoring the Lawsons?" "According to Agent Martinez, the investigation into Richard Lawson's financial crimes has been ongoing for over a year," she replied. "The timing of today's arrest appears to be coincidental to the passenger conduct incident, but it certainly adds another layer of complexity to the situation." Agent Martinez overheard this exchange and approached them with Richard Lawson still in handcuffs beside him. "Actually," the agent said, "the timing isn't entirely coincidental. We've been waiting for Mr. Lawson to attempt to leave the country before making our arrest, as it demonstrates flight risk and strengthens our case." When this aircraft was flagged for the passenger conduct investigation, our automated monitoring systems alerted us that Lawson was attempting to depart for London, which triggered our arrest protocols. Damon felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease as he realized that his decision to activate Protocol 7 had inadvertently helped the FBI apprehend a financial criminal who might otherwise have escaped justice by fleeing to a country without extradition agreements. "So, Victoria's behavior didn't just get her banned from flying," he said slowly. "It also led to her husband's arrest for crimes that had nothing to do with what happened on this airplane." "That's correct," Agent Martinez confirmed. "Mrs. Lawson's assault on you triggered a security review that brought Mr. Lawson to our attention at exactly the moment we were prepared to make our arrest. In a way, her poor behavior helped us catch a criminal who had been stealing money from retirees and pension funds for years." Emma, who had been listening to this conversation with the intense focus that children bring to adult discussions they don't fully understand, raised her hand again. "Excuse me," she said to Agent Martinez. Does this mean the mean people were hurting other people too? Not just the nice boy? Agent Martinez knelt down so that he was at Emma's eye level, his stern expression softening slightly as he addressed the child. Yes, sweetheart, he said gently. The man who just got arrested was taking money from people who needed it to live people like your grandparents who worked hard their whole lives and saved money for when they got older. Emma nodded with the serious expression that children adopt when they're processing information that doesn't fit with their understanding of how the world is supposed to work. That's really bad, she said solemnly. I'm glad you caught him so he can't hurt any more nice people. Agent Martinez smiled for the first time since boarding the aircraft. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. As Richard Lawson was led away by federal agents, his shoulders hunched and his face pale with the realization that his life as he had known it was over, Damon found himself thinking about the interconnected nature of privilege and corruption, about how people who felt entitled to treat others badly often turned out to have other moral failings that ran much deeper than simple rudeness or discrimination. The first-class cabin, which had been the site of so much tension and conflict just an hour earlier, now felt strangely peaceful. The passengers who remained were looking at each other with the kind of shared understanding that comes from witnessing something significant together, something that would probably become a story they would tell for years to come about the time they saw justice served at 30,000 feet. Elena Voss approached Damon with her tablet, her expression returning to its professional neutrality now that the immediate crisis had been resolved. Mr. Rivers, she said, we've cleared both Mr. and Mrs. Lawson from the passenger manifest, and we've completed our security review. The aircraft is ready to continue to London whenever you're comfortable proceeding. Damon looked around the first-class cabin, noting the way the other passengers were watching him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright admiration. He thought about Victoria Lawson probably sitting in an airport security office somewhere trying to figure out how to get to London without access to any major airline. He thought about Richard Lawson facing federal charges that would likely result in decades in prison. And then he thought about Emma, the 8-year-old girl whose innocent questions had somehow helped guide everyone toward understanding what was really important in this situation. Actually, he said to Elena, before we continue to London, I think there's something else we need to do. The first-class cabin felt different now that the Lawsons had been removed, as if the air itself had been cleansed of the toxic energy that Victoria's behavior had introduced. The remaining passengers were looking at Damon with expressions that ranged from curiosity to genuine admiration, recognizing that they had witnessed something more significant than a simple passenger dispute. Elena Voss was consulting her tablet, coordinating with ground operations to finalize the passenger manifest changes and prepare for departure when Damon approached her with an expression that she had learned to recognize over years of working with the Rivers family as someone who was about to make a decision that would complicate what should have been a straightforward situation. Elena, he said quietly, I need to ask you about Victoria Lawson's current situation. What exactly happens to her now? Elena looked up from her tablet with the slightly wary expression of a legal professional who suspected she was about to be asked to do something that would make her job more difficult. Mrs. Lawson has been escorted from the aircraft and is currently being processed by Port Authority security. She's been placed on the no-fly list for all Rivers Holdings partner airlines, which means she'll need to find alternative transportation to London. Given that we partner with virtually every major carrier, her options are quite limited, so she's essentially stranded at JFK, unless she can find a charter flight or decides to take a ship across the Atlantic. Yes, she's stranded. Her credit cards are likely frozen due to her husband's arrest, and she has no immediate way to access funds or arrange alternative travel. Damon was quiet for a moment, considering the implications of what Elena had just told him. Victoria Lawson was undoubtedly a person who had behaved badly, who had shown her true character when she thought there would be no consequences for her actions. But she was also a human being who was probably sitting in an airport security office right now facing the collapse of everything she had thought was secure in her life. Emma, who had been coloring quietly but clearly listening to the adult conversation around her, looked up from her book and addressed Damon directly. "Are you the nice boy who can help the sad lady?" she asked in her clear, honest voice. "I know she was mean to you, but she looked really scared when the police took her away." Damon knelt down so that he was at Emma's eye level, struck once again by the way children could cut through complex adult emotions and situations to identify what was really important. "What do you think I should do, Emma?" he asked, seriously, treating her question with the respect it deserved. Emma considered this carefully, her young face creased with concentration as she worked through the moral complexities of the situation. "Well," she said, "finally my mommy always tells me that when someone is mean to me, I should try to be kind back to them because maybe they're mean because they're sad or scared about something." And the pretty lady looked really, really scared. Eleanor Emma's grandmother placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder and smiled at Damon with the kind of expression that suggested she was proud of her granddaughter's wisdom, but also curious to see how an adult would respond to such clear moral guidance. Sometimes Eleanor said quietly, "Children see things more clearly than the rest of us because they haven't learned yet that kindness is supposed to be complicated." Damon stood up slowly, his mind working through the implications of what Emma had suggested. His father had always taught him that true power was not about punishing people who wronged you, but about using your advantages to create positive outcomes even in difficult situations. "Elena," he said, turning back to the legal counsel, "I want to arrange alternative transportation for Victoria Lawson." Elena's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sir, I feel obligated to point out that Mrs. Lawson physically assaulted you and engaged in discriminatory behavior that violated federal transportation regulations. You would be well within your rights to pursue criminal charges, and there's certainly no obligation for you to assist her in any way." "I understand that," Damon replied. "But I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in doing something that I can live with, something that reflects the values my parents taught me about how to treat people, even people who don't necessarily deserve kindness." From her seat across the aisle, the fashion editor, who had been recording the earlier confrontation, looked up from her phone with an expression of genuine surprise. She had covered enough celebrity scandals and public relations disasters to recognize the usual patterns of retaliation and revenge that typically followed public humiliations, and this was decidedly not following those patterns. "You're actually going to help her?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "After what she did to you?" Damon looked at her with the kind of calm certainty that comes from making a decision that aligns with your deepest values, even when those values conflict with what might feel emotionally satisfying in the moment. "She made a mistake," he said simply. "A bad one that revealed some ugly aspects of her character, and she's facing consequences for that mistake that will probably change her life forever. But I don't think making her life worse is going to make mine better, and I don't think it's going to teach her anything useful about how to be a better person." Elena was already typing on her tablet, presumably making notes about the logistics of arranging alternative transportation for someone who was currently banned from all major airlines and whose access to financial resources had been severely limited by her husband's arrest. "What exactly did you have in mind, Mr. Rivers?" she asked. "Book her a seat on the next available charter flight to London," Damon said. "Economy class basic accommodations, nothing fancy, and arrange for temporary access to funds so she can handle immediate expenses once she arrives." Sir Elena said carefully, given her financial situation and her husband's legal troubles, it's unlikely she'll be able to repay any assistance you provide. "I'm not expecting repayment," Damon replied. "I'm expecting her to have a chance to figure out what kind of person she wants to be now that her old life has been taken away from her." Emma clapped her hands together with the kind of spontaneous joy that children express when adults around them make choices that align with their sense of fairness and kindness. "That's really nice," she said happily. "Now the sad lady won't have to stay at the airport forever, and maybe she'll learn to be nicer to people." The tech executive in 4B, who had been quietly observing this entire exchange, closed his laptop and looked at Damon with an expression that suggested he was reevaluating his assumptions about wealth power and how people choose to use both. "That's remarkably generous," he said, "especially considering that most people in your position would be looking for ways to make sure she faced maximum consequences for her behavior." "Maybe," Damon said, settling back into his rightful seat in 3A for the first time since this entire incident had begun. "But I've learned that how you treat people when you have power over them says more about who you are than it does about who they are." Elena finished her arrangements and looked up from her tablet with the satisfaction of someone who had just solved a complex logistical problem. "It's done," she said. "Mrs. Lawson will be notified that charter transportation has been arranged for her along with temporary financial assistance. The flight leaves in 4 hours, which should give her time to process what's happened and make any necessary arrangements." Sophia, the flight attendant who had been trying to manage this situation since it first began, approached Damon's seat with a genuine smile that was completely different from the professional pleasantries she had been offering throughout the morning. "Mr. Rivers," she said, "I've been working in commercial aviation for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a situation like this with as much grace as you just showed. It gives me hope that there are still people in the world who understand that having power means using it responsibly." Damon accepted the compliment with a modest nod, but his attention was already shifting toward the next challenge: how to use this incident as an opportunity to create something positive that would last longer than the news cycle. "Sophia," he said, "what would you say if I told you that I want to turn this entire experience into something that could help prevent similar situations in the future?" "I'd say that sounds like exactly the kind of thing the world needs more of," she replied without hesitation. "Good," Damon said, pulling out his phone and opening his notes app, "because I have some ideas and I'm going to need help from people who understand how these problems actually affect passengers and crew members on a daily basis." 4 hours later, as Damon's original flight was finally crossing over the Atlantic Ocean at cruising altitude, Victoria Lawson was sitting in seat 23F aboard a charter aircraft that was following the same route but carrying a very different group of passengers. Instead of the polished luxury of commercial first class, she was surrounded by business travelers who had booked last-minute seats, aid workers heading to refugee camps, and students studying abroad on tight budgets. The seat was narrow and cramped with barely enough legroom for her to cross her legs, and the meal service consisted of a sandwich wrapped in plastic rather than the 3-course dinner with wine pairings she was accustomed to expecting during transatlantic travel. But what struck her most was not the physical discomfort, but the way the other passengers treated each other with casual kindness and consideration that seemed to come naturally rather than being performed for social advantage. The young woman sitting next to her, a medical student heading to London for a semester abroad, had noticed Victoria's obvious distress during takeoff, and had quietly offered her a bottle of water and a packet of tissues without asking any questions or expecting anything in return. It was a small gesture, but it had touched Victoria in a way that surprised her with its intensity. "Thank you," Victoria had whispered, accepting the water with hands that were still shaking slightly from the emotional shock of the morning's events. "No problem," the medical student had replied with a gentle smile. "Flying can be stressful, especially when you're dealing with other stuff too." Victoria had wanted to explain that she wasn't afraid of flying, that she had crossed the Atlantic dozens of times in first-class luxury, that her distress had nothing to do with the aircraft and everything to do with the complete collapse of her understanding of herself and her place in the world. But she found herself unable to form the words, unable to articulate how someone could wake up as one person and by lunchtime discover that they were someone else entirely. Meanwhile, on the original flight, Damon was sitting in his rightfully assigned seat in first class, but his attention was focused on a conversation he was having with Emma, who had asked if she could visit him in the front of the plane to thank him for helping the sad lady. Eleanor had agreed to let her granddaughter make the trip forward on the condition that she not disturb other passengers. And now Emma was perched on the armrest of Damon's seat, her coloring book open in her lap, explaining her theory about why some adults forgot how to be nice to each other. "I think it's because they get so worried about being important that they forget about being good," she was saying, with the kind of matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes display when discussing complex moral issues. Like they think being important means other people have to do what they want, but really being important means helping other people feel better. Damon was taking notes on his phone as Emma talked, recognizing that her observations contained insights about human behavior and social dynamics that most business school courses never touched on. "That's really smart, Emma," he said seriously. "What do you think would help adults remember how to be good instead of just trying to be important?" Emma considered this question with the focused attention she usually reserved for particularly challenging coloring pages. "Maybe if someone reminded them that everyone used to be a kid like me," she said finally. "Kids don't care if your clothes are fancy or if you have a lot of money. Kids just care if you're nice to them and if you play fair. So you think the problem is that adults forget what it was like to be children. I think they forget that everyone else used to be children too," Emma clarified. "Like that pretty lady probably forgot that you used to be a kid just like me. So she thought it was okay to be mean to you because she thought you were different from her. But really, everyone is the same on the inside, where the kid part lives." Damon looked at this 8-year-old girl with something approaching awe, realizing that she had just articulated a theory of human empathy and social conflict that was more sophisticated than most academic papers he had read on the subject. "Emma," he said, "how would you feel about helping me start a program to teach adults about the things you just told me?" Her eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that children show when adults take their ideas seriously. "Really? You think what I said could help people be nicer to each other? I think what you said could change the world," Damon replied, and he meant it completely. On the charter flight, Victoria was experiencing her own moment of revelation, though hers was more painful and more complicated than Emma's simple wisdom. The medical student sitting next to her had started a conversation about her work with underserved communities, describing the way that poverty and discrimination affected people's health outcomes in ways that most privileged people never had to consider. "The thing is," the young woman was saying, "when people don't have access to basic resources, everything becomes harder. Getting to work, getting health care, getting their kids to school. But instead of recognizing that the problem is the system, we often blame individuals for not being able to overcome obstacles that we've never had to face." Victoria found herself thinking about Damon Rivers, about the assumptions she had made based on his appearance and his age, about the way she had automatically concluded that he didn't belong in first class without knowing anything about his background or his circumstances. "I think I might have done something like that this morning," she said quietly, the words feeling strange in her mouth because she wasn't accustomed to admitting fault or examining her own behavior with any kind of critical honesty. The medical student looked at her with the kind of non-judgmental attention that healthcare professionals learn to offer patients who are struggling with difficult truths. "It's hard to recognize our own biases," she said gently. "We all have them, but most of us don't get opportunities to see how they affect other people in real time. The important thing is what you do with that recognition once you have it." Victoria stared out the small charter aircraft window at the dark Atlantic Ocean below, thinking about the choice she faced now that her old life had been stripped away from her. She could spend her energy trying to rebuild the same kind of privileged existence she had lost fighting to regain her status and her sense of entitlement. Or she could use this experience as an opportunity to become someone different, someone better, someone who understood that true security came from knowing that you had treated other people with the dignity and respect that everyone deserved. Back on the commercial flight, Sophia was taking a break from her duties to continue the conversation with Damon about his ideas for preventing similar incidents in the future. "The thing is," she was explaining, "most discrimination in aviation happens in subtle ways that are hard to document or prove. It's not usually as obvious as what happened this morning. It's more like passengers getting ignored or having their requests dismissed or being treated with suspicion when they ask for normal services. So what would help, Damon asked. More training, different policies, better oversight. All of those things would help. Sophia said, but I think the most important thing would be changing the culture so that crew members feel supported when they stand up for passengers who are being mistreated. Right now, flight attendants often feel like they have to choose between doing what's right and keeping their jobs. What if there was a way to make doing what's right the path to keeping their jobs, rather than a risk to their careers? Sophia's eyes brightened with interest. That would change everything. If crew members knew that their companies would back them up when they protected passengers from discrimination, if they knew that standing up for people would be recognized and rewarded instead of punished, then these situations would be handled very differently. Emma, who had been listening to this conversation while working on a new page in her coloring book, looked up with a question. "What if kids like me could help?" she asked. "What if there was a way for children to tell airlines when adults were being mean to other adults, so the grown-ups would have to pay attention and fix the problems?" Damon and Sophia exchanged a look of surprise and admiration as they realized that Emma had just identified a crucial element that was missing from most anti-discrimination initiatives: the voices of children who often saw social dynamics more clearly than adults because they hadn't yet learned to accept injustice as normal. Emma Damon said, "I think you just gave me the missing piece of something really important." 6 months later, Victoria Lawson sat in a small office in East London, reviewing financial literacy materials that she would be presenting to a group of refugee families the following morning. The office belonged to a non-profit organization that helped asylum seekers navigate the complex British immigration and social services systems, and Victoria had been volunteering there for the past 4 months as part of her effort to rebuild her life in a way that actually meant something. The woman she was working with, a former refugee from Somalia who now managed the organization's educational programs, had been patient with Victoria's initial awkwardness and obvious discomfort with her new circumstances. It had taken time for Victoria to adjust to being helpful, rather than demanding help, to being the person who solved problems, rather than the person whose problems were solved by others. "The numbers look good for next week's workshop," the program manager was saying, reviewing the registration list on her computer screen. "We have 15 families signed up, and most of them are dealing with the kind of financial challenges that your presentation addresses really well." Victoria nodded, feeling the familiar flutter of nervousness that she still experienced before teaching these workshops. She had discovered that helping people understand budgeting and financial planning was completely different from managing her own privileged lifestyle, requiring empathy and patience and the ability to explain complex concepts in simple, accessible language. "I've been thinking," Victoria said carefully, "about adding a section on recognizing financial scams, especially the ones that target people who might not be familiar with British banking systems." "That's an excellent idea. Do you have experience with that kind of fraud?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, thinking about her husband's criminal enterprise and the way she had benefited from money that had been stolen from people who couldn't afford to lose it. She had testified against Richard during his trial, helping prosecutors trace financial transactions and identify victims. But she still carried the weight of knowing that she had lived comfortably on the proceeds of other people's misery for years, without asking questions she should have asked. "I have more experience than I'd like to admit," she said, finally. "My ex-husband was involved in investment fraud, and I learned a lot about how these schemes work and who they target during the investigation and trial." She had legally changed her name to Victoria Sterling after her divorce was finalized, and Richard was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. She was no longer the woman who had slapped a teenager on an airplane because she thought his presence in first class somehow diminished her own status. But she was still working every day to understand who she wanted to become instead. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Damon Rivers was sitting in a conference room at the headquarters of the Rivers Foundation, reviewing quarterly reports on the Emma Initiative, the program he had launched to address discrimination in transportation and hospitality industries through the voices and perspectives of children. The program was named after Emma Walsh, the 8-year-old girl whose innocent questions and moral clarity had helped guide everyone toward better choices during the airplane incident. Emma, now 9, served as the program's youngest advisor and had become something of a celebrity advocate for treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their age, race, or apparent social status. "The results from the airline partnership program are really encouraging," said Dr. Sarah Martinez, the child psychologist who directed the initiative's research efforts. Flight attendants who have completed the Emma Protocol training report feeling more confident about intervening in discriminatory situations, and passenger complaint data shows significant improvements in customer service across all demographic groups. The Emma Protocol was a training program that taught airline and hospitality workers to see conflict situations through the eyes of children, asking questions like, "What would a child think about this behavior? And how would I explain this situation to my 8-year-old daughter?" The approach had proven remarkably effective at helping adults recognize their own biases and respond to discrimination with the kind of moral clarity that children brought naturally to social situations. "What about the Youth Advisory Board?" Damon asked. "How are they adapting to their increased responsibilities?" The Youth Advisory Board consisted of children between the ages of 8 and 16 who reviewed discrimination complaints, participated in policy development, and provided feedback on training materials. Their insights had proven invaluable in designing interventions that actually addressed the root causes of prejudice rather than just its surface manifestations. "Emma's been incredible," Dr. Martinez replied. "She has this ability to cut through complex social dynamics and identify the core issues that adults sometimes miss because we're too invested in defending our own perspectives." Emma herself was currently in London with her grandmother visiting the non-profit organization where Victoria Sterling volunteered. The visit had been arranged through the Emma Initiative's partnership program, which connected young advocates with adults who were working to make amends for past discrimination. In the small office in East London, Emma was sitting across from Victoria, reviewing the materials for the upcoming financial literacy workshop with the kind of focused attention she brought to all new learning opportunities. "These look really helpful," Emma said, flipping through the worksheets and guides that Victoria had developed. "But I think you should add pictures because some of the people might not read English very well yet." Victoria smiled, recognizing the same direct, practical wisdom that had made such an impression on Damon 6 months earlier. "That's an excellent suggestion, Emma. What other changes do you think would make these materials more accessible?" Emma considered this question with the serious concentration she always applied to problems that involved helping people. "Maybe you could have examples that show families like the ones who will be in your class," she said. "Like if someone is from a different country, they might not understand examples about American things, but they would understand examples about things they know from their own life." As they worked together on improving the workshop materials, Victoria found herself thinking about the path that had led her from that terrible morning on the airplane to this small office where she was learning to be useful rather than entitled, learning to contribute rather than just consume. "Emma," she said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you think people can really change? Like if someone has been selfish and mean for a long time, do you think they can learn to be better?" Emma looked at her with the kind of direct honesty that children use when they're considering important questions. "I think everyone can learn to be better," she said finally. "But they have to really want to, and they have to practice every day like learning to play piano or learning to read. And they have to say sorry to the people they were mean to and mean it." Victoria felt her throat tighten with emotion as she realized that this 9-year-old girl had just described exactly what she had been trying to do for the past 6 months, learning to be better through daily practice, making amends to the people she had hurt, and working to ensure that her future actions would reflect the values she wished she had always lived by. "I think you're right," Victoria said. "And I think you're going to help a lot of people learn to be better, just by showing them how to see the world the way you see it. Emma smiled with the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that your words have been helpful to someone who needed to hear them. That's what the Emma Initiative is for, she said simply, to help grown-ups remember how to be good. 3 years after the incident on Flight 892, the world of commercial aviation looked subtly but significantly different. The Emma Initiative had expanded beyond its original focus on transportation to include hospitality, retail, and educational institutions, creating a network of young advocates who worked with adult allies to identify and address discrimination in all its forms. Damon Rivers, now 22 and serving as CEO of the Rivers Foundation, was preparing for the 3rd annual Emma Initiative Conference, which would bring together child advocates, industry professionals, and researchers from around the world to share strategies for creating more inclusive and equitable social systems. The conference was being held at a hotel in Chicago, and Damon had just finished reviewing the program when his assistant knocked on his office door. "Mr. Rivers," she said, "there's someone here to see you. She says she has something that belongs to you." Damon looked up from his conference materials, curious about what this could possibly mean. "Did she give you her name?" "She said to tell you it's from Victoria Sterling and that you would understand." Damon felt a flutter of surprise and curiosity as he realized that Victoria had apparently traveled to Chicago to see him in person. Over the past 3 years, they had exchanged occasional messages through the Emma Initiative, brief updates on her volunteer work and his foundation activities, but they had never spoken directly since that morning on the airplane. "Please send her in," he said. Victoria entered his office looking completely different from the woman he remembered from 3 years earlier. Her platinum blonde hair had grown out to its natural brown color, and she was dressed in simple, practical clothes that suggested someone who spent her time focused on work rather than appearances. But the most significant change was in her expression, which carried a peace and confidence that seemed to come from knowing that her life had purpose and meaning. "Hello, Damon," she said simply. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "Of course," Damon replied, standing to greet her. "My assistant said you have something that belongs to me." Victoria smiled and reached into her bag, withdrawing a small, beautifully wrapped package. "This is from Emma," she explained. "We've been working together on the financial literacy program in London, and she wanted to make sure you received this personally." Damon opened the package to find a hand-bound book with a cover that had been decorated in Emma's distinctive artistic style. The title, written in careful block letters, read, "How to Remember to Be Good, A Guide for Grown-Ups," by Emma Walsh and her friends. Inside the book contained stories, drawings, and practical advice from dozens of children who participated in Emma Initiative programs around the world. Each page offered a different perspective on kindness, fairness, and the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect, written in the clear, honest language that children used when they wanted adults to understand important truths. She spent 6 months collecting these contributions, Victoria explained. She wanted to create something that would help adults remember what really matters when they're faced with difficult decisions about how to treat other people. Damon flipped through the pages, noting the diversity of voices and experiences represented in the collection. There were stories from refugee children who had experienced discrimination in schools, drawings from kids who had witnessed bullying and chosen to intervene, and essays from young people who had learned to see past differences in race, religion, and economic status to find the common humanity that connected everyone. "This is incredible," Damon said, genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness and wisdom contained in the small book. Emma has created something that could help change the way adults think about their responsibilities to each other. Victoria nodded, her expression reflecting the pride and affection she had developed for Emma over their months of working together. "She has a gift for helping people see themselves more clearly," Victoria said. "Working with her has taught me more about who I want to be than any other experience in my life." They talked for another hour about the progress of various Emma Initiative programs, about the challenges of creating lasting social change, and about the way that children's perspectives could illuminate solutions to problems that adults often made unnecessarily complicated. When Victoria finally prepared to leave, she paused at the door of Damon's office. "Damon," she said, "I know I can never fully make up for what I did to you 3 years ago, but I want you to know that every day I try to honor the grace you showed me by treating other people the way you treated me even when I didn't deserve it." Damon looked at this woman who had traveled across an ocean to deliver a book from a child who had spent 3 years rebuilding her life around service to others, who had transformed herself from someone who excluded people into someone who included them. "Victoria," he said, "I think you've already made up for it. The person you've become, the work you're doing, the way you're helping other people learn and grow, that's worth more than any apology." As Victoria left his office, Damon opened Emma's book to a random page and found a drawing of an airplane with children of different races and backgrounds sitting together, all wearing smiles. Underneath, in Emma's careful handwriting, was a simple message: "Everyone belongs everywhere they have a ticket to go." Damon smiled, recognizing the truth that a 9-year-old had understood better than most adults, that dignity wasn't about where you sat, but about how you treated the people sitting around you. The Emma Initiative would continue to grow and spread that message, one child, one adult, one airplane seat at a time. If this story inspired you to think differently about power privilege and the choices we make when no one is watching, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true-to-life stories that remind us of our shared humanity. The Emma Initiative mentioned in this story is fictional, but the need for the kind of moral leadership that children like Emma represent is very real. Sometimes the most powerful thing any of us can do is remember what it felt like to be 8 years old and see the world as a place where everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and respect.